Gideon Varick didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode his horse straight through Clara Whitlock's front gate, trampling the small garden her late husband had planted the spring before he died, and he didn't slow down until he was close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his coat. 60 days, Mrs. Whitlock, he said, looking down at her from the saddle like she was something he'd already purchased. Then that banknote comes due, and when you can't pay it, he smiled, slow and patient, the way a man smiles when he's already counted your money. You come find me. I'll give you a fair price. For the land. He didn't say and everything on it. He didn't have to. Clara stood on her porch and watched him ride back out the same gate he'd destroyed coming in. She didn't say a word. Her hands were shaking, but she pressed them flat against her apron so he couldn't see. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything you had left and smiled while doing it, then you already know exactly how she felt in that moment. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. And if you've ever had to fight to keep what was yours, hit that like button and stay with us. Because what Clara Whitlock did next, and the stranger she let through her door, is a story worth every minute. The morning Silas Rourke rode into Red Willow Crossing. He had $4 in his front pocket, a saddle that had seen better decades, and a letter of reference from a cattle outfit in Abilene that had let him go 3 weeks before. Not for drinking, not for stealing, not for any of the reasons a man usually loses a cattle job at 53 years old. They'd let him go because the owner's son had come back from the East with a business degree and new ideas about payroll, and Silas was one of 6 men who didn't fit into the new numbers. The foreman had shaken his hand when he left. The owner's son hadn't looked up from his desk. Silas had told himself it didn't matter much. He'd been let go before. He'd land somewhere else, he always did. But somewhere between Abilene and Red Willow Crossing, riding alone through grassland that seemed to go on without caring about him in either direction, he'd started to feel something he couldn't quite name. Not sadness. Something older than sadness. Something closer to the feeling you get when you realize a road you've been on for 30 years hasn't actually been taking you anywhere. He was tired. Not sleepy tired, the other kind. He rode into town on a Tuesday, which was the slowest day Red Willow Crossing had, and tied his horse outside a feed store where a handwritten notice had been tacked to the post. Ranch hand wanted. Briar Hollow, West Road, 2 miles past the creek crossing. Inquire with Mrs. Whitlock. Honest work. Fair wages. No drinkers. Silas had read that notice 3 times. Mrs. Whitlock. He wasn't sure he wanted to work for a woman. Not because he had anything against women, he'd known plenty of capable ones in his years, but because a woman running a ranch alone usually meant the ranch was in trouble, and a ranch in trouble meant short wages and early endings, and he'd had enough of both. But he had $4, a tired horse, and no better prospects, so he copied the directions down on the back of his Abilene letter and rode west. He almost turned back twice. The first time was when he crossed the creek and noticed how low the water was, running a bad sign in June, worse in the years ahead if the drought didn't break. A man who'd spent 30 years reading land could feel trouble in water levels the same way a doctor reads a pulse. The second time was when he came over a low rise and saw the ranch itself. Briar Hollow was not a disaster, but it was close. The main barn needed 2 new boards on the south side. The west fence was sagging in a way that meant cattle had been leaning on it without anyone pushing back. There was an unfinished well near the second pasture that looked like it had been abandoned mid-dig, the wooden frame still standing, but the ground around it untouched, weeds growing right up to the edge. And the house was just a house, white paint going gray. A porch with 1 step that had rotted through and been covered with a plank that wasn't quite the right size. A chimney with a crack in the mortar that someone had stuffed with rags. Silas sat on his horse at the end of the drive for a long moment. Then he rode up anyway. He didn't get as far as knocking. Clara Whitlock came out of the barn before he reached the porch, walking with the kind of no-nonsense stride that told him immediately she'd heard his horse coming and had already decided she wasn't impressed. She was somewhere in her early 40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that told the same story her ranch did. Capable hands. Hard-working hands, but hands that had been doing more than one person's share of the work for too long. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked at him. He noticed she didn't smile. He noticed she didn't introduce herself either, as if she'd decided that explaining who she was in front of her own barn was not something she was going to bother doing. "You hear about the notice," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "How old are you?" He hadn't expected that to be the first question. 53. She looked at him the way a person looks at a horse they're considering buying honestly, without pretending the inspection was anything other than what it was. "You worked cattle before?" 30 years of it. "Where most recently?" "Abilene. Strickland outfit let me go 3 weeks ago." "I've got a letter." "I don't need a letter," she said. "Letters say what people want to say." "What did you do for Strickland?" "Everything. Started on fence crew, moved to cattle handling. Last 6 years I was helping the foreman with records grazing rotations, water access, that kind of thing." Something shifted in her expression at the word records. Just slightly. But Silas noticed it. "You can read survey maps?" she asked. That was also not a question he expected. "Well enough," he said. Clara looked at him for another long moment. A crow landed on the barn roof behind her and made one ugly sound, then flew off. Neither of them looked at it. "The work is hard," she said. "The wages are honest but not generous. The house has a bunk room that's clean and dry. You'll take meals at the main table. I don't run a separate cook situation." "That's fine. I also don't." She paused, choosing words. "I run things the way I run them. I explain my reasons when there's time and not always when there isn't. If that bothers a man, he won't last here." Silas looked at the sagging west fence. He looked at the unfinished well. He looked at the cracked chimney. And he looked at Clara Whitlock, who was clearly holding all of this together through something that was more than just will. It was a particular kind of stubbornness that came from refusing to admit out loud that she was running out of room. "When do I start?" he said. She almost smiled. Almost. "I haven't hired you yet," she said. "Come inside. We need to talk." He hadn't expected to be sitting at her kitchen table within 10 minutes of arriving. He hadn't expected coffee either, but she poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of him and sat down across from him with the kind of directness that meant this was not a social visit, even though they were sitting in her kitchen. She put her hands flat on the table. "I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone in Red Willow Crossing," she said. "And I'm telling you, because if you're going to work here, you need to know what you're walking into." And because she stopped, and for just a moment, something crossed her face that wasn't stubbornness, wasn't practicality, wasn't the controlled competence she'd been wearing since he rode up. It was something tired and honest and unguarded. "Because I'm done pretending the situation is manageable when it isn't." Silas said nothing. He'd learned long ago that when someone is about to tell you the truth, the worst thing you can do is interrupt them. "My husband died 14 months ago," she said. "Heart." He was 51. We had no warning. She said it simply, without dramatics, which somehow made it worse. "He left me this ranch, 70 head of cattle, creek frontage on the western boundary, and a banknote for $380 that comes due in 60 days. Silas's hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. The bank has been, she chose the word carefully, less than cooperative. They'll deal with a man. They have a harder time dealing with a woman who doesn't have a man standing behind her. I've been to the bank 4 times. I've brought my books, my records, my cattle assessments. The manager listens politely and then explains in very kind language that the bank needs to feel confident in the operations leadership. Her voice was flat, not angry. She'd already burned through the anger, he could tell. This was what was left on the other side of anger, a cold, precise assessment of the problem. "What does Varick have to do with it?" Silas said. Clara looked at him sharply. "How do you know about Varick?" "I stopped in town for water before I rode out. Man at the feed store mentioned that Briar Hollow had good creek frontage and that Varick had been interested in acquiring it. He said it like he was telling me about the weather." Clara's jaw tightened. Of course he did. She looked down at the table for a moment. "Gideon Varick owns the largest ranch in this county. He has wanted this creek access for 3 years. My husband wouldn't sell. I won't sell. But Varric is, she picked her words with visible care, a patient man. He's been patient for 3 years. He believes I'll run out of options. Will you? She looked at him. It was a blunt question, and he'd known it was blunt when he asked it, but he'd asked it anyway because he needed the honest answer, and he suspected she needed to say it out loud. In 60 days, that note isn't paid or restructured. Yes, she said. I've run the numbers. Selling cattle won't cover it without gutting the herd so badly the ranch can't function. I've written to other banks. The answer is always some version of the same thing. And I don't have family who can help. So why are you telling me? Silas said. I'm a ranch hand. I can fix your fence. I can't fix your bank problem. Clara looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he started to feel slightly uncomfortable, which didn't happen to him often. Then she said, I have one option I haven't tried. She said it like she was picking up something heavy and didn't want to drop it. The law, she said carefully, is different for a married woman with a husband involved in the operation. The bank would restructure the note if there were a husband present who could be listed as co-owner. Varric would have a much harder time operating the way he does if there were a man formally invested in this property. Silas went very still. I'm not telling you this, as she stopped. I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not looking for romance. I'm not looking for someone to take over. I am looking for someone who will come into a legal partnership with me, work this land honestly, be named on the deed and the bank papers, and help me keep what my husband and I built. Silas said nothing. In return, Clara continued, you'd receive wages, a home, and an equal voice in every decision about this ranch. Not as an employee, as a partner. She paused. I understand how this sounds. It sounds like you're asking me to marry you, Silas said. Yes, she said. That's what I'm asking. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the pasture, a cow made a low sound and then was silent. Silas looked at this woman across the table from him, this woman he had known for approximately 40 minutes, who had told him hard truths with no decoration on them, who had asked him to marry her the same way she'd asked him about surveying maps, which was to say directly and without embarrassment, even though it had clearly cost her something to say it, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Not love. He wasn't a fool. He knew what love was and what this wasn't, but something adjacent to it. Something that was about more than her, something about the ranch, and the creek, and the sagging fence, and the unfinished well, and the way she'd said what my husband and I built with her hands flat on the table like she was keeping it from sliding away. He had spent 30 years working other men's land, 30 years being useful and belonging nowhere. The Strickland outfit had given him a handshake. They hadn't even said his name when they let him go. He looked at Clara Whitlock. She was watching him without any particular expression because she had already said everything she was going to say, and she wasn't the kind of woman who added to a question while the other person was still thinking. I have one condition, he said. She waited. I won't be a name on a paper, he said. If I'm in, I'm working this ranch like it's mine. That means I make real decisions. I tell you when I think you're wrong. I don't disappear when it gets hard. Something in Clara's face changed. Just slightly. Just enough. That, she said quietly, is exactly what I'm asking for. He looked out the window at the sagging west fence. He thought about $4 and a worn-out saddle and 30 years of other men's land. He thought about the way the echo would sound if he drove a fence post into soil that was his. All right, Silas Rourke said, I'll marry you. Clara looked at him for one more moment. Then she stood up, picked up both coffee cups, and carried them to the sink. You can start on the west fence tomorrow morning, she said. We'll go to the courthouse Thursday, and just like that, the arrangement was made. He lay awake that night in the clean, dry bunk room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the Kansas wind move across the roof of Briar Hollow, and he understood that he had just made the strangest decision of his life. What he didn't understand yet, what neither of them understood yet, was that the ranch they were trying to save was sitting on top of that would make everything that came after a great deal more dangerous. and that Gideon Varick already knew the secret. Silas just didn't know that yet. They got married on a Thursday morning in the Red Willow Crossing courthouse, which smelled like old paper and linseed oil and had a crack running up the east wall that someone had painted over without fixing. The justice of the peace was a heavy-set man named Aldous Briggs, who had married somewhere north of 300 couples in that room and had long since stopped pretending any of it was romantic. He read the words from a small book he held at arm's length because he'd lost his reading glasses sometime in the spring and hadn't replaced them yet. Clara wore a dark blue dress that Silas suspected was the nicest thing she owned. She hadn't done anything elaborate with her hair. She stood straight and answered when she was supposed to answer and signed where she was supposed to sign, and at no point did she look like a woman in the middle of a dream she'd always had. She looked like a woman completing a necessary transaction with the intention of getting back to work as quickly as possible. Silas respected that more than he could have explained. He signed his name next to hers. His handwriting was slow and deliberate in the way of a man who'd taught himself to read and write as an adult and had never fully lost the carefulness of it. Aldous Briggs stamped the paper, handed them each a copy, and said, "Congratulations," in a tone that suggested he was already thinking about lunch. They drove back to Briar Hollow in Clara's wagon without speaking much. The horses knew the road. The June heat was building early, the kind of dry heat that settled on Kansas in the mornings and didn't lift until well after dark. About a mile out from the ranch, Clara said, "I want to be straightforward with you about something." "All right," Silas said. "People in town are going to talk. Some of them are already talking. They'll say I married a stranger out of desperation, and most of them won't be entirely wrong." She was looking at the road. "I don't need you to defend me to anyone. I don't need you to explain our arrangement. But I need you to understand that whatever people say, I made this decision with my eyes open." "I'm not embarrassed by it." Silas thought about that for a moment. "I'm not embarrassed either," he said. "I want you to know that." She glanced at him sideways. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like she'd been carrying a small stone in her shoe and had just acknowledged it was there without stopping to remove it yet. "Good," she said. And then they were back at the ranch, and the horses needed unhitching, and there was no more time for talking. That was in many ways the whole shape of the first weeks. Silas came to understand Briar Hollow the way he'd always come to understand a new place, not through asking too many questions, but through watching and doing and paying attention to what the land itself was trying to tell him. He walked the fence lines. He counted cattle and cross-referenced the numbers against the records Clara's late husband had kept in a battered ledger in the desk drawer. He inspected the unfinished well and climbed down far enough to understand why the previous crew had stopped. They'd hit a layer of hard limestone shelf that needed the right tool to break through, not harder effort. He'd fixed harder problems. At night, he ate at the main table with Clara, and they talked about ranch business the way two people talk about a patient they're both responsible for, practically, honestly, sometimes with disagreement. The first real disagreement came on the 6th day. Silas had looked at the grazing rotation and decided the south pasture was being overworked. The cattle needed to be moved to the north 40 for at least 3 weeks to let the grass recover. Clara listened to him explain this. Then she said Tom always kept them on the south through June. With all respect to Tom, Silas said carefully, because he'd already learned that Tom Whitlock was not a topic to be careless about. The south pasture grass is shorter than it should be for this time of year, and there's a dry spot in the middle that's been getting bigger. If we push another 3 weeks on it, we'll be buying hay in August that we don't have money to buy. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had her hands around her coffee cup, which she did when she was thinking hard. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He walked her out to the south pasture in the early morning while the light was still flat and cool, and he pointed out the dry spot, and he showed her where the root systems were beginning to thin at the soil surface, which meant the grass wasn't recovering between grazing cycles the way it should. Clara crouched down and ran her fingers through the grass. She pressed her palm flat against the dirt. She stood up without saying anything and walked back toward the barn. He wasn't sure how to read that, until at noon he saw her moving the cattle herself toward the north gate. She hadn't said you were right, but she also hadn't needed to. He got back to work on the well. By the end of the second week, Silas had broken through the limestone shelf with a rented drill bit from a man in town who ran an equipment service, and the well had hit water at 38 feet, better than the original well, deeper and more reliable. He and a hired day laborer named Pete, who was 17 and strong and didn't talk much, spent 2 days finishing the frame and the casing and rigging the pulley. When the first bucket came up clean and cold, Silas drank from it and said nothing, but he stood there for a while longer than he needed to. Clara came out to look at it that afternoon. She walked around the well once, checking the casing, testing the pulley rope. "This is good work," she said. She said it the way she said everything directly, without decoration. "It'll hold," he said. "There's enough pressure down there to run a pipe to the cattle tank if you want it. Save some hauling in the dry months." She looked at him. "How much would that cost?" "Materials, maybe $40. "I can do the labor." She did the math in her head. He could see her doing it. "Do it," she said. "But tell me before you buy anything over $5. I need to know where every dollar goes right now." Understood, she nodded and walked back to the house. At the door, she stopped and said, without turning around, "Tom tried to get that well working for 2 years. She went inside. Silas looked at the well for another moment. Then he went to find Pete and told him they'd be running pipe next week. It was the closest thing to a compliment he would get from her for another 10 days, and somehow that made it mean more, not less. The trip to the bank happened on a Wednesday, 18 days after the wedding. The bank manager was a man named Gerald Purcell, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the careful manner of someone who had spent a career being pleasant while saying no. He had a photograph of his family on his desk and a very clean pen set that looked like it had never been used for anything important. He shook Silas's hand with the kind of firm warmth that hadn't been anywhere in evidence during Clara's previous 4 visits, and Silas felt the ugliness of that, the simple ugly fact of it, settle in his stomach like a bad meal. He didn't say anything about it. Not yet. Purcell laid out the situation with the patient professionalism of a man who believed he was doing them a favor by being honest. The note was $380. The interest had accrued to $412. The bank's standard restructuring terms required a down payment of $150 and would extend the note 18 months at 8%. "We don't have $150, Clara said. "I understand, Mrs. Whitlock. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Rourke." Purcell smiled at the correction. "Perhaps, Mr. Rourke has resources. What I have," Silas said, setting both hands flat on the desk, the same way Clara had set her hands on the kitchen table the day she'd asked him to marry her, "is 70 head of cattle on Good Creek frontage, with a second water source now operational, a repaired fence line, and 2 pastures in rotation. What I also have is documentation that this ranch has been mismanaged, not because of the widow who's been running it alone for 14 months, but because it's been chronically undercapitalized by a bank that has been extending excellent credit to every male rancher in this county, while offering a grieving woman 4 polite rejections." Purcell's smile became careful. "Now, Mr. Rourke, I don't think that's quite a fair. I want to restructure at 6% over 24 months with no down payment, or I want to know the name of your regional supervisor so that I can write him a letter that includes Clara Whitlock's 4 previous visits, the dates, and the documented value of the assets she presented each time." Silas picked up his hat from his knee. "Either works for me." The office was quiet. Clara was looking at him. He couldn't read her expression and didn't try. Purcell uncapped his very clean pen. "I think," he said carefully, "we can find terms we're all comfortable with." They walked out of the bank 40 minutes later with a restructured note at 6.5% over 20 months and no down payment required. Clara didn't say anything until they were in the wagon and moving. Then she said, "You didn't tell me you were going to do that." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't sure he'd respond to it until I was in the room with him and could see what kind of man he was. And if he'd called your bluff, do you actually know his regional supervisor?" "No," Silas said. "I know there is one because every bank has one." Figured Purcell knew that too. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was something in the same neighborhood. It was brief and quickly controlled, but it was there. "Don't do that to me again without warning," she said. "Try," he said, which was honest at least. She shook her head slightly. They drove back to Briar Hollow in the June heat, and Silas thought about the look on Purcell's face when he'd uncapped that pen, and he felt something that was satisfying in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Not because he'd won something for himself, because he'd won it for her. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. He just noted it was there. The record books changed everything. Silas had been working through Tom Whitlock's ranch records in the evenings after supper, partly because Clara had asked him to get familiar with the cattle history, and partly because he was the kind of man who couldn't look at an incomplete picture without wanting to understand what the missing pieces were. Tom Whitlock had been a thorough record keeper. The cattle logs were detailed and consistent. The grazing maps were careful. The expense records were honest, in the way of a man who trusted that someday someone else would need to read them and wanted that person to have the truth. But on the third evening, about halfway through the second ledger, Silas found something that stopped him. It was tucked between 2 pages of cattle tallies from 4 years back, a folded piece of paper in slightly different handwriting, rougher than the ledger entries. The kind of writing a man does when he's thinking out loud, rather than recording for posterity. It was clearly a note Tom had written to himself, probably meaning to come back to it and either do something about it or throw it away. He'd never done either. The note said, "Survey line, Western Creek boundary, Harmon marked at 1,861. Compass drift, check against Varick fence post placement. If Harmon was off even 3-4 degrees, the line could run 60-80 yards further west than filed." Silas read it twice, then he read it a third time slowly. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the wall for a while. He understood what this meant. Compass drift was a real phenomenon in land surveys. A surveyor's compass needle could be thrown off by mineral deposits in the soil, and if Harmon had made a small error in 1,861, it would have been carried forward in every subsequent survey that used his original line as its base point. A drift of 3 or 4 degrees over the distance involved could absolutely move the legal boundary 60 to 80 yards west, which meant if Tom's suspicion was correct, the current filed boundary of Briar Hollow's Western Creek access might not be the true boundary. The real boundary could be significantly further west, which meant the deepest, most reliable, most drought-resistant section of the creek might not be on the edge of the Whitlock property, might be solidly in the middle of it. Which meant the thing Varick had been patiently maneuvering to acquire the water access that made Briar Hollow worth fighting for might be far more securely within Clara's legal ownership than anyone currently understood. Or, and this was the thought that sat cold in his stomach, Varick might already know this, which would explain a great deal about his patience and his timing, and the way he'd ridden through Clara's gate like a man visiting property he'd already decided was eventually going to be his. Silas folded the note carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't sleep well that night. He didn't tell Clara immediately. Not because he was keeping it from her, he wasn't going to keep it from her, but because he needed to think it through before he brought her a half-formed theory, and because he'd learned enough about Clara Whitlock in 3 weeks to understand that bringing her a problem without also having a proposed response was not the most effective way to have a conversation with her. He spent 2 days quietly working through it. He identified 3 things he needed to know. First, whether Tom's suspicion about the Harmon survey was mathematically plausible. Second, whether there was any record in the county files of the original 1,861 survey being questioned or reviewed at any subsequent point. Third, and most critically, whether Varick had done any of his own survey work near the western fence in recent years. The first question he answered himself with a ruler, a compass, and Tom's old maps spread out on the kitchen table on a Saturday morning when Clara had driven into town for supplies. He plotted the Harmon line, then applied a 4-degree drift correction, and the result made him set the pencil down carefully and stand up straight. If Harmon's compass had been off by even 3.5 degrees, the true western boundary of Briar Hollow was not just the ranch's lifeline. It was the heart of the entire creek access for miles in either direction. The section that came in scope under the corrected line was a spring-fed deepening in the creek bed that never fully ran dry even in bad drought years. Every rancher within 15 miles knew that section. They all watered cattle there in the bad summers. Varick's entire ranch, all 1,200 acres of it, depended on access to that section. And under a corrected survey, it would be on Clara's land, not adjacent to it, on it. The second question took him to the county records office, where a cheerful elderly woman named Dottie told him that the 1,861 Harmon survey had never been revisited, challenged, or supplemented in any official capacity. The third question was answered for him that same afternoon on the road back from the county seat when he passed within a quarter mile of the western fence line and spotted something that made him pull his horse up hard. There were fresh stake holes in the ground near Varick's side of the fence. Not old ones, the disturbed soil around them was less than 2 weeks old. And the stakes themselves were gone, which meant someone had pulled them after using them to mark something and didn't want the marks to be visible. Somebody had been surveying the western fence line recently, and whoever had done it was not interested in sharing the results. Silas rode back to Briar Hollow with Tom's note in his pocket and a very clear understanding of why Gideon Varick had been so patient for 3 years. Varick knew, or suspected strongly enough that it amounted to the same thing. He wasn't waiting for Clara to fail because he wanted her land at a discount. He was waiting because he needed time to either legally challenge the western boundary before anyone else noticed the Harmon error, or more likely to acquire the property through financial pressure before anyone on Clara's side ever thought to look too closely at a 30-year-old survey made with a possibly faulty compass. Clara Whitlock had been sitting on the most valuable water rights in the county for 14 months and didn't know it. And the man who'd been riding through her gate uninvited had known almost the whole time. He told her that night after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with Tom's maps spread between them and Tom's note laid flat where they could both see it. He went through it methodically. The note, the math, the county records, the stake holes. He didn't soften it or build up to it. He just told her the whole picture, in order, and then stopped talking and waited. Clara sat very still throughout. She looked at the maps. She picked up Tom's note and read it herself twice. She set it back down. Then she said, "He knew, Tom? Seems like it. Seems like he was starting to work it out and didn't get far enough before he got sick." "No." Her voice was flat and very controlled. "Tom. My husband." She looked up. "Varick. He knew, or he figured it out. That's why he's been. That's what this whole thing has been about. That's what I think," Silas said. Clara stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the dark pasture. 3 years, she said quietly. Not to him, really. More to herself. 3 years of coming around here with that smile and those polite offers. Waiting. While Tom was sick, he came to visit. Brought a ham. Said he hoped Tom recovered soon. She stopped. He brought us a ham. Silas said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She stood at the window for a full minute. When she turned around, her face was different. Not soft. Clara's face never really did soft, but something harder had settled into it. A different kind of hard than grief. This was strategic. "What do we do?" she said. "We hire an independent surveyor," Silas said. "Someone from outside this county who has no connection to Varick or to anyone here. We get them out to the western fence line before Varick has any idea we're doing it. The corrected survey confirms what Tom suspected. We file it with the county recorder immediately. Same day if possible. And if Varick tries to challenge the new survey, he can try. But a 30-year-old compass error documented by an independent professional with a filed correction on record is a very difficult thing to challenge legally, especially if we file first." Clara looked at him. "How much will a surveyor cost?" "I don't know yet. I'm going to find out tomorrow." "Can we afford it?" "We can't afford not to." She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, with the decisiveness she brought to everything she decided. "Find the surveyor," she said. "I'll leave at first light." She started gathering up the maps. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was set. "Silas," she said, without looking up from the maps. Yeah, Tom tried to protect this, she said. He figured out something was wrong and he was trying to find his way to it. She smoothed the edge of the map down flat. I'd like to finish what he started. It was the most she'd said about Tom in a single breath since Silas had arrived. He recognized what it cost her. We will, he said. She nodded, still not looking up. Good night. Good night. He went to the bunk room. He lay awake listening to the Kansas dark and thinking about stake holes and compass drift, and a man who'd brought a ham to a dying neighbor while mentally calculating what his land was worth. Sleep didn't come easy, but when it came, it was the sleep of a man who had a plan. The surveyor's name was Edward Cass, and he came from a county 50 miles north. Recommended by a land attorney Silas had found through the county records, Clerk Dottie, who had turned out to be an excellent source of quiet, reliable information about who in the region could be trusted and who couldn't. Cass was a lean, methodical man in his 60s who wore the same expression whether he was eating breakfast or discovering a 30-year survey error. He arrived on a Monday morning with 2 assistants and equipment that looked expensive and well-maintained, and he spent most of the morning walking the western fence line without saying much. Silas walked with him. Clara stayed back at the ranch, partly to keep working and partly, Silas suspected, because if she came out to that fence line and stood on what might turn out to be her own land, the waiting would be unbearable. He understood that. Cass worked steadily through the morning. He took measurements. He cross-referenced. He made marks in a small notebook and occasionally murmured numbers to one of his assistants, who wrote them down without comment. He was not a man who told you what he was finding until he was ready to tell you, which Silas found mildly maddening but ultimately trustworthy. At around 2 in the afternoon, Cass stood on the far side of what had always been understood to be the fence line, the Varick side, and looked at his notebook for a long time. Then he looked at Silas. The 1,861 Harmon survey, he said, has a documented compass declination error of approximately 4.2 degrees. That's not unusual for that period magnetic north shifts, and instruments from that era weren't always corrected for local variation. He tapped his notebook. The corrected boundary, applied against proper declination data for this location and this period, places the true western boundary of this property. He took 3 steps further west, into what had always been understood to be Varick's edge, approximately here. How far is that from the current marked line? Silas said. 73 yards. The number sat between them in the hot afternoon air. Silas looked west, across those 73 yards, to where the creek deepened into the wide, permanent pool that never fully dried even in the worst drought years. The section that every cattle operation for 15 miles depended on in the bad summers. Every inch of it was on Clara Whitlock's land. I'll need 2 days to finalize the documentation, Cass said. Then I'd suggest filing immediately. 2 days, Silas said. All right. He rode back to the ranch. Clara was in the barn when he got there, brushing down one of the horses with the focused, repetitive motion of someone who had been keeping their hands busy to keep their mind from running too far ahead. She heard him come in and kept brushing. Well, she said. 73 yards, Silas said. The brush stopped moving. She turned around. He nodded once. Clara Whitlock put the brush down on the stall rail very carefully, like she was setting down something fragile. She pressed both hands flat against the wood. She didn't cry. He hadn't expected her to. But she closed her eyes for just a moment. And in that moment, he could see everything the 14 months alone. The 4 trips to the bank. Varick's ham. The shaking hand she'd pressed flat against her apron so he couldn't see. All of it passing across her face like weather. Then she opened her eyes. 2 days, she said. Her voice was steady. 2 days, he confirmed. Then we file. First thing, she picked up the brush. She went back to work. Silas stood in the barn doorway and watched her for a moment longer than he needed to, and then went to start the evening water rounds. 48 hours later, they filed the corrected survey with the county recorder. 48 hours after that, someone set the western range on fire. The smell reached him before the light did. Silas woke at 4:30 in the morning, with his eyes open and his body already sitting up before his mind had fully caught up with what had pulled him out of sleep. He'd spent enough years sleeping outdoors, in bunkhouses and line camps, and once for 3 weeks under a wagon during a cattle drive that had gone badly sideways, that he'd developed the kind of sleep that wasn't really sleep, more like a long blink that ended the moment something in the air changed. The air had changed. He was out the bunkroom door in his boots and shirt before he'd finished the thought, and he smelled it clear and unmistakable in the pre-dawn dark. Not the ordinary smell of cook smoke or a chimney burning off. This was the heavy, rolling smell of dry prairie grass, catching the kind of smell that had a physical weight to it, that pushed itself against your face and told you something large was happening. He ran to the far end of the barn and looked west. The horizon in that direction was not the flat dark it should have been. There was a long orange line sitting low against the grass about 3/4 of a mile out, and it was moving. Even from this distance, even in the dark, he could see the way the flames were jumping, not crawling the way a slow fire crawls when there's no wind, but racing, hopping from clump to clump of dry June grass with the eager, unpredictable energy of fire that has room to run and enough fuel to keep going. The wind was pushing it east, toward the cattle, toward the creek, toward the western boundary they had filed 72 hours ago. He was already running toward the house. He hit the porch steps hard and hammered on the door with his fist 3 times. Clara, fire, western pasture, get up now. He didn't wait for her answer. He was already turning back toward the barn. She was on the porch in under a minute, which told him she slept the same way he did, close to the surface, never fully down. She had her boots on and her hair loose, and she looked at the western horizon the same way he had. With that moment of still assessment that comes before action, when you're someone who has learned that panicking costs you the first 30 seconds you can't afford to lose. How far, she said. 3/4 of a mile. Winds east. It'll hit the pasture fence in 20 minutes, maybe less. Cattle are in the north 40. I know, I'm going to drive them to the creek bank. Fire can't cross the water. The west fence. Forget the fence, he said. The fence burns and we rebuild it. The cattle go in the creek, we lose some to the current if they panic, and the water's running fast. He grabbed his saddle off the rail and threw it on the bay mare without slowing down. I need you to stay at the house. If it comes this far east, I need you too. No, she said. He looked at her. I'm not staying at the house, she said. The way she said it left no space for argument. It wasn't defiance exactly, it was simpler than defiance. Statement of fact about who she was. Tell me what you need. He cinched the saddle fast, and his mind was already 3 moves ahead. He knew what he needed. He needed a fire break. A real one. Not a scraped line, a break wide enough that the fire would run up to it and find nothing to carry it forward. That meant turned earth, and turned earth on that scale in 20 minutes meant one thing. The heavy plow, he said. The Percheron and the heavy plow. You cut a break starting from the north fence line and run it south toward the creek. Straight line as wide as you can manage. Don't try to get ahead of the fire, just cut behind where it's going to be. She was already moving toward the corral where the big draft horse lived. Silas. She said his name and he was in the saddle and looking at her. Those cattle go in the creek, and the water takes some of them. We lose a month of everything. I know. Don't lose the cattle. I'll do my best. That wasn't a request, she said. She had the Percheron's halter in her hands, and she was looking at him with an expression he'd not seen on her before, not fear, not quite, but something that lived close to it. Something that was about more than cattle. Come back. He didn't answer that. He wheeled the mare and rode hard into the dark toward the north 40. The cattle could smell it too. By the time Silas reached the north pasture, the herd was already uneasy shifting, pressing against each other, the lead cows throwing their heads in the direction of the fire smell with that particular agitated rolling motion that meant they were 30 seconds from making a bad collective decision. He'd seen cattle panic in fire before, and it was one of the most dangerous things in ranching, not because cattle were fast, but because 70 animals moving in the same direction without thinking was a force that would take a fence or a man's horse down with equal indifference. He rode the fence line on the east side of the pasture first, getting downwind of the herd, letting them smell the horse before they saw him. That was the trick with spooked cattle. You didn't charge at them from the direction they were already afraid of. You came from where they thought safety was, and you pushed slow and wide until the herd shape started to shift on its own. The orange line on the western horizon was bigger now. He could hear it, a low, continuous crackling that sounded almost peaceful from this distance, the way a campfire sounds peaceful. Except this one was 100 yards wide and moving at a walking horse pace toward everything he and Clara had been rebuilding for the past month. He got the herd moving south. Not running that was the worst outcome. Walking, pressed, nervous but directed, he worked the edges of the group on the bay mare, cutting back whenever a cow tried to break from the side, keeping the pressure on the rear to maintain momentum. His horse was good at this. She'd been a cutting horse in a previous life. He could feel it in the way she read the cattle, anticipating breaks before they happened. They were 2/3 of the way to the creek when the wind shifted. Not much. Maybe 15 degrees, but 15 degrees was enough. The fire, which had been running on a line that would have taken it north of the cattle trail, bent slightly south. The crackling sound got louder, and then, without any warning, a burning clump of dry tumbleweed skipped past the fire's front on a gust and landed in the dry grass 40 yards to Silas's east between the cattle and the creek. The herd felt it before he saw it. 60 cattle swung hard to the right in a mass movement that nearly unseated him when his mare spun to follow. No, no, no. He was already driving her into the right flank of the herd, pushing hard, trying to bend them back south. He had maybe 90 seconds before the spot fire grew enough to fully block the route to the creek. He pushed the mare as hard as he'd pushed a horse in 10 years. The cattle bent. Slowly, badly, with 3 cows breaking north that he let go because he couldn't be in 2 places. But the main body bent back south and found the gap between the spot fire and the fence and moved through it in a stumbling, pushing rush that got the first 20 animals to the creek bank before the spot fire closed off the gap entirely. Silas counted on the move. He was short, significantly short. At least 30 cattle were still on the wrong side of the spot fire and now separated from the creek by a growing wall of burning grass. He looked at the situation for exactly 2 seconds, which was all he had. Then he turned the mare toward the burning section and rode at it. Not through it, he wasn't going to kill his horse, but along it, fast, riding the margin between burned ground and unburned, looking for a gap. Fire and dry grass burned from the bottom up and moved fast at the front, but behind the front there was often a section where the grass had already burned off, and the ground was scorched, bare, still hot, still smoking, but not actively burning. A gap in the front could give him a corridor. He found one. Barely. It was about 8 feet wide, and the ground on either side was still smoldering, and the smoke was bad enough that the mare threw her head up in protest. But she went through because he asked her to, and because she was, at bottom, a good and brave horse who trusted the person on her back more than she trusted her own instincts, which was the only reason this worked. He came through the gap on the far side, coughing hard, eyes streaming from the smoke, and he was back with the 30 separated cattle. He drove them hard. Not neat, not careful. This was not the time for careful. He rode at the back of the group and pushed them fast toward the only remaining route to the creek, which was a narrow section along the east fence that the fire hadn't reached yet. They made it. All 30 of them jammed through that fence gap in a rush that bent the east fence post 6 inches out of true and would require replacement later, but they made it to the creek bank and stopped at the water's edge. Silas pulled up the mare and looked back. The entire western pasture was burning now. The fire had crossed the original fence line, what had been the original fence line. Before Cass's survey moved it 73 yards further west, and it was eating through the summer grass in great rolling waves of orange that were beautiful in the purely visual sense that catastrophic things sometimes are when you're not in them. He couldn't see Clara. He couldn't see the plow. He could hear it, distantly, the heavy thump of the Percheron's hooves on baked earth, the grind of the plow blade, but the smoke was thick enough in the western pasture that visibility was down to maybe 100 yards. His chest did something it hadn't done in a long time. He turned the mare toward the smoke and rode toward the sound. Clara had gotten the Percheron moving within 4 minutes of Silas riding north. She'd worked with draft horses all her married life, And she knew the Percheron, a big gray named Walker, which had been Tom's joke because Walker was the laziest horse they'd ever owned when he wasn't in harness. In harness, he was different. He pulled with the enormous, grinding determination of an animal that had been bred for exactly this kind of work, and he didn't spook easily, which was the only reason what Clara was about to do was remotely possible. She got the plow hitched in the dark by feel as much as sight, because she'd done it hundreds of times, and because there was no time to find the lantern. She climbed to the plow seat and drove Walker out of the barn lot and toward the western fence at a pace that was faster than a plow horse should go, and she was asking him for it anyway. She'd understood Silas's instruction clearly. She was not cutting ahead of the fire. She was cutting behind where it was going, trying to create a break that would stop it from advancing further east once it hit the line. The goal wasn't to save the western pasture. The western pasture was already lost. The goal was to save everything east of it. The goal was to save the ranch. She drove Walker along the north fence line first, dropping the blade and letting it bite deep into the summer-hard earth. The plow threw up a dark furrow behind her, and Walker leaned into the collar and grunted with the effort of breaking hardpan in dry June, and Clara stood on the footrest and leaned her weight onto the handles to keep the blade from skipping. She made one pass. Then she pulled Walker wide, dropped the blade again, and made a second pass parallel to the first, widening the break. The fire smell was very strong now. The light on the western horizon had gone from a line to a general orange glow that lit the smoke from underneath, and the smoke was moving toward her faster than the fire itself, which was how grass fires worked. The smoke came first, and you couldn't see what was behind it. She made a third pass. The heat was noticeable now. Not dangerous, she was still well ahead of the fire's position, but real. The kind of heat that you felt on your forearms and the sides of your face when the wind shifted toward you. Walker felt it too. He slowed slightly, tossing his head, not refusing but asking the question that horses ask when they're uncertain about what you're asking them to walk toward. "Keep going," she said to him, not loud, just level. The same voice she used to keep herself calm, which worked on horses the same way it worked on herself. He kept going. She was on the fourth pass, running south toward the creek when she lost the reference point in the smoke. That was the bad moment, the moment when visibility dropped to 50 yards, and the orange glow was now coming from two directions, because the spot fire that had cut off Silas's cattle route had spread, and she couldn't see whether her break was going to connect with the creek bank or stop short. She couldn't stop to figure it out. Stopping was not an option. She drove Walker south on dead reckoning, counting his strides the way she used to count fence posts when she rode this pasture in early morning before the sun was up. She hit the creek bank with 8 feet to spare. The plow blade dropped into the soft soil of the bank, and Walker stopped hard as the blade buried itself, and Clara almost went over the handles, catching herself on the seat with both hands. She sat there for a moment, breathing. The fire break was not perfect. In the smoke and dark, she couldn't see its full length, but she could feel that it connected. She'd come from the Fentrener fence to the creek bank in 4 passes, and the break behind her was wide enough to give fire serious resistance. Whether it was wide enough to stop it was something she was about to find out. She unhitched Walker from the plow and led him to the creek bank because he'd earned water, and because if the fire jumped the break, she was going to need to move fast, and she needed him mobile. She stood at the creek's edge with her hand on Walker's neck and looked east toward the ranch house, which she could see the lamp she'd left burning. In the kitchen window was a yellow point in the dark, and she thought about how far it was and whether she should move now. She stayed. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she knew it. She stayed because the break was there, and she needed to know if it held, and because leaving felt too much like what Varric had expected her to do every time things got hard enough. She was done doing what Varric expected. The fire front hit the break about 8 minutes after she reached the creek. She heard it before she saw it, the crackling rising to a roar as the main fire body reached the eastern edge of the western pasture and found the turned earth. The orange glow brightened hard. Flame tips rose above the smoke, visible even through it, reaching and jumping and looking for something to grab. The brake held on the north half. She could see it fire running to the edge of the bare earth and falling back. On the south half, near the middle, a clump of uncut grass at the edge of the brake caught. One small spot of fire jumped the line. Clara was already moving. She grabbed a feed sack she'd thrown in the plow box. She'd thought of this because it was the sort of thing you thought of when you'd been fighting prairie fire before, and she had twice during her years on this ranch, and she soaked it in the creek in 3 seconds and ran to the spot fire and hit it. Once, twice, 3 times, the damp sack beat it flat. She soaked it again and hit it again, just to be sure. Spot fire went out. The main fire front ran to the edge of the brake and stopped. Not cleanly fire never did anything cleanly, but it stopped. It burned along the edge of the brake, looking, and it found nothing north of the creek bank that it could take. And after a while it began to pull back on itself as the unburned grass behind the front was consumed and the fire ran out of fuel. Clara stood at the edge of the creek with her arms shaking and smoke in her lungs and ash in her hair and the wet feed sack hanging from one hand, and she watched the fire stop. That was when she heard hoofbeats coming hard through the smoke from the north. Silas pulled up the mare 15 feet from her and looked at her for a moment in the orange-lit dark. He was smoke-blackened. There was a burn on his left forearm that he clearly hadn't noticed yet because he hadn't looked at it. His hat was gone somewhere. Brake held, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. I see that, he said. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they weren't certain they'd see again. Cattle? She said. All of them. East Bank. She let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for the past 20 minutes. I lost a fence post, she said, on the east side. Bent it out trying to get them through fast. 1 fence post, he said. All right. She looked at the fire line, which was still burning but contained now, eating through the last of the western pasture grass in a slow, diminishing crawl. The ranch house was dark against the eastern sky. The cattle were on the creek bank, somewhere north of them. She could hear them moving. The creek itself ran quiet behind her. On the other side of it, the far side, their side now. The side that had always been their side, even when nobody knew it. The permanent deep pool sat undisturbed, catching the last of the firelight on its surface. 73 yards of corrected boundary, every inch still theirs. Silas, she said. Yeah, this wasn't an accident. No, he said. It wasn't. She'd known that in her bones from the first minute she'd seen the glow. Prairie fires happened, but they didn't happen beside a newly filed survey boundary 48 hours after filing. Not like this. Not in June with the wind from the right direction and the fire starting at exactly the right spot to cut the cattle off from the water. He's trying to create chaos, she said. In the middle of it, you lose cattle. You lose the markers. You give him grounds to reopen the boundary dispute and claim confusion. That's what I think, Silas said. She looked at the burning pasture. A significant portion of the western range was going to need replanting. The grass that had been there was gone. They'd need to buy in hay for at least 6 weeks to keep the herd fed while it recovered. That was money they didn't have in comfortable supply. Can you prove he ordered this? She said. No, Silas said. Not yet, she nodded. She'd expected that answer. The answer she hadn't expected came 30 seconds later. But that's not the problem we need to solve right now, he said, and something in his voice made her look up at him. He was looking north toward the ridge that formed the upper boundary of the western pasture. Because we've got a more immediate issue. She followed his gaze. On the far ridge north, high enough to be well clear of the smoke and the fire, 2 men sat on horseback, watching. They were far enough away that faces meant nothing, but the posture was clear. They were not passers-by. They were not neighbors who'd spotted the fire and ridden over to help. They were sitting still, watching, with the specific kind of stillness that belongs to men who are where they intended to be. Clara felt the cold that went through her, in spite of the fire heat still rolling off the western pasture. They were watching, she said. Not a question. From before it started, I'd guess, Silas said. They wanted to see it work. What are you going to do? He was already turning the mare north. Talk to them, he said. Silas, she took a step toward his horse, without quite deciding to. There are 2 of them. He looked down at her. In the firelight, with the ash on his face and his hat gone, and that burn on his arm he still hadn't noticed, he looked like someone she hadn't seen before. Not harder than she'd thought he was. Something more precise than hard. "I'm not going to fight them," he said. "I'm going to tell them something they need to hear." He rode north into the smoke. The two men on the ridge didn't ride away when they saw him coming. That told him something: either they were confident enough in their position not to feel threatened by a single rider, or whoever had sent them hadn't given them instructions for this particular scenario, and they were stalling while they figured out what to do. He rode up to within 20 yards and stopped. He took his time looking at them. Both in their 30s. Working clothes, not ranch hands. The equipment was wrong, too clean, but not foremen either. The kind of men you hired for jobs that weren't on any payroll record. He'd seen the type before. They were watching him with the careful blankness of men trying not to give anything away, which already told him they had something to give. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't accuse anyone of anything, he said in an even voice that carried clearly through the smoke-heavy air. The corrected survey was filed with the county recorder day before yesterday. There are certified copies in the county seat, in the county recorder's private file, and in the office of a land attorney 50 miles north of here. Burning a fence line doesn't change what's on those papers. The two men said nothing. Whoever sent you out here tonight built this plan around the idea that the boundary question was still open, Silas continued. It's not open anymore. It's settled. The only thing that happens now when someone tries to challenge the western boundary is that it draws attention to the survey, which draws attention to why anyone would want to challenge it, which is a conversation that isn't going to go well for the person who sent you. One of the men shifted in his saddle. The other kept his face blank. "You've got two choices," Silas said. "You can ride down there and help beat back what's left of that fire. You do that. You ride home as neighbors, and nobody mentions tonight to anyone. Or you can ride back to whoever hired you and tell him that you watched a woman cut a fire break with a plow horse in the dark and saved her own ranch, and the papers are already filed in 3 locations. And the next time he tries something like this, I'm not going to ride up to a ridge to have a conversation." He let that sit for a moment. Then he turned the mare and rode back toward the fire line without looking back. He heard them 30 seconds later. Not riding down to help, he hadn't expected that, not truly. But riding away, not west, toward Varick's property. South toward the main road. Men who'd been hired for a job that had already failed, putting distance between themselves and the evidence of it. He came back to Clara at the creek bank. She looked at him. "They're gone? They're gone. Did they say anything?" "No," he said. "I didn't need them to." She looked at the fire, which was burning itself out now along the margin of the break, pulling back to the stubble of the western pasture and dying for lack of anything left to eat. The sky to the east was beginning to separate from the horizon, the first barely perceptible difference between night and the hour before dawn. They stood at the creek bank together for a while, without speaking. The cattle moved on the bank behind them, still unsettled but calming. Walker stood knee-deep in the water and drank with the deep, satisfied rhythm of an animal that had done hard work and knew it. "How bad is the western pasture?" Clara said finally. "Bad, it'll come back. Burned ground in Kansas usually comes back greener in the fall than it was before." "That's a long way from now, it is." She looked at the stubble field that the western pasture had become. In the early pre-dawn light, it was a gray and black expanse that still sent up thin columns of smoke in places where roots were smoldering underground. "We're going to need hay," she said. 6 weeks minimum. Maybe 8. I'll write to my husband's cousin in Salina. He owes Tom a debt he never paid. She said it practically matter-of-factly the way she said everything. But Silas heard the weight in it, the reaching back to things from before, from the life that had existed before 14 months ago, and using them to build the life that existed now. "That's a good idea," he said. She nodded. She pushed a strand of smoke-darkened hair back from her face. She had a smear of ash on her cheek, and she either didn't know it was there or had decided it wasn't worth addressing. "Your arm," she said, looking at his left forearm. He looked down. There was a burn there, 2 inches long, where he'd gone through the gap in the fire on the mare. blistered but not deep. He'd had worse. "It's all right," he said. "I'll put something on it when we get back to the house," she said, in a tone that didn't leave room for arguing about it. "All right." She looked at him for a moment, just for a moment, and it was the early pre-dawn dark and smoke was still thick enough that reading her face precisely was difficult. But he thought he saw something there, not the exhausted assessment of the situation, not the practical calculation she usually wore, but something underneath those things. Something quieter. "You rode back into it," she said. "For the cattle. That's what you said to do." "I said don't lose the cattle. I didn't say ride through a burning gap in the dark." "The gap was there," he said. "I used it." She looked at him for another moment. "You could have lost the horse," she said. "She's a good horse." "I trusted her." Clara said nothing for a while. The dawn was coming slow, as Kansas dawn always was, the sky lightening in sections from the east with the particular long-suffering patience of prairie mornings. "We should move the cattle off the bank before full light," she said. "Get them settled in the east pasture." "I know," he said. But neither of them moved quite yet. The creek ran behind them, quiet and uninterrupted, carrying snowmelt from somewhere north through the deep pool that had always been theirs even when nobody knew it. The firebreak stood dark and raw between the burned western range and the unburned east pasture. Not beautiful, not clean, but effective. The boundary markers were still in place. The filed copies of the survey were 50 miles away in a locked office. The fire had come and it had not been enough. Whatever Varick had expected to gain from the night, he had not gained it. The ranch was scarred, but it was still standing. The water was still theirs. The papers were filed. The cattle were alive. Silas started toward the herd to begin moving them. "Silas," Clara said. He stopped. She was looking at the burned western pasture, not at him. "Tom would have come back greener," she said quietly. "That's what he used to say about burned ground. It always comes back greener." She said it not like she was telling Silas something, but like she was telling Tom something. Like she was letting him know that his ranch was still standing, and the water was still there, and someone was still fighting for it the way he would have wanted it fought for. Silas didn't answer. There was no right answer to that. He gave her the moment she needed. Then they both went to move the cattle, in the slow gray light of a Kansas morning with smoke still rising from the western range, and the creek running clear and cold behind them, and Briar Hollow held. The days after the fire had a particular quality to them that Silas had experienced once before, after a bad flood on a cattle drive in his late 20s, a kind of raw, dripped-down clarity, where everything unnecessary had been burned away, and what was left was just the work and the people doing it, and the ground under their feet. There was no room for anything complicated. You woke up. You assessed the damage. You fixed what could be fixed today, and made a list of what couldn't. You ate when you remembered to, and you slept when your body stopped, letting you continue. The cattle had come through with fewer losses than he'd feared. 64 head accounted for on the east bank by mid-morning the day after. 6 were missing, and he and Pete spent 2 days searching the creek brush north of the ranch, before finding 5 of them tangled in a windbreak a mile and a half upstream, spooked so far out of their territory that they'd walked in circles until they hit the tree line. The 6th, a 3-year-old steer they never found. Silas put it in the ledger as lost and didn't dwell on it. Dwelling didn't bring cattle back. The western pasture was going to be the long problem. 32 acres of summer grass had burned down to stubble, and in June with the dry heat already building, the ground wasn't going to produce anything useful until fall rains came, if they came at all. Clara's letter to Tom's cousin in Salina went out the morning after the fire, and the response came back in 4 days, 6 weeks of hay credit, no cash required, to be settled at fall market. It was a fair arrangement, and Clara accepted it without the kind of gratitude that would have made the other man feel like he'd done something extraordinary, which Silas noticed and respected. She treated the debt as a business matter because that was what it was, and treating it any other way would have made it harder to manage. Pete came back for 3 days of fence work after the fire, and Silas paid him from his own pocket without telling Clara, because Pete's family had a small operation 2 miles east, and Pete's father had ridden over the morning after the fire with 2 of his sons to help move cattle, and hadn't asked for anything in return. And Silas believed in that kind of accounting, even if it didn't show up in any ledger. The west fence needed complete replacement for 160 yards. The east fence post he'd bent getting the cattle through was straightened and reset. 2 sections of the fire break that Clara had cut needed to be turned a second time to prevent regrowth of the burned stubble from bridging the gap, and Walker the Percheron did this work with his usual grinding reliability, which Silas had come to appreciate the way you appreciate any creature that simply does what it was built to do without complaint or drama. News traveled through Red Willow Crossing the way news always traveled in small settlements imprecisely but quickly. By the end of the first week after the fire, Silas had been stopped twice in town by men who wanted to know what had happened, and he'd told them plainly and without embellishment each time. A fire had started beside the western boundary. The break had held. The cattle were safe. The corrected survey stood on record. He said it the same way both times, like he was reading from a document, because he understood that in a small settlement, the story that gets told in the first week is the story that sticks. And he wanted the story that stuck to be simple and clear and not particularly exciting. What he didn't say both times was anything about the 2 men on the ridge. He didn't mention them to anyone in town. He didn't mention them to Dottie at the county records office. He didn't mention them to the sheriff, because the sheriff in Red Willow Crossing was a man named Haskett, who had been sheriff for 11 years and had a ranch of his own and had worked alongside Gideon Varick on the County Cattlemen's Association for most of that time, and Silas had learned enough about small settlements to understand that the chain of information wasn't always as straight as the chain of authority. He mentioned the 2 men exactly once, to Clara, the evening of the second day after the fire. They were at the kitchen table with the ledger between them working through the damage estimates, and he told her what he'd seen, what he'd said, and what they'd done. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the ledger for a moment without seeing it. "You don't think Haskett can be trusted," she said. Not an accusation, an assessment she was running to see if it matched his. "I think Haskett is a careful man," Silas said. "I think careful men in small places are careful because they've learned whose displeasure is expensive. I'm not saying he'd lie for Varick. I'm saying I don't know that he wouldn't, and I'm not interested in finding out the hard way. So we do nothing. We do everything," he said. "We get the west fence back up. We keep the herd healthy. We make our note payment on time. We make sure every person in this county who matters understands that Briar Hollow isn't in distress and isn't vulnerable and isn't going anywhere." He paused. "That's what we do instead of talking to Haskett." Clara looked at him. Her expression was in that particular register she used when she was deciding whether she agreed with something not hostile, not warm, just genuinely evaluating. "That's a long game," she said. "Varick's been playing a long game for 3 years," Silas said. "I'm just playing it back." She looked at the ledger. She picked up her pencil and wrote a number in the column and set the pencil down. "All right," she said. That was the end of the conversation about Haskett. The burn on Silas's arm healed without infection, which Clara credited to the poultice she'd put on it the morning after the fire, and Silas credited to luck, and they were probably both partially right. It left a scar about 2 inches long on his left forearm, pale and slightly raised, that he noticed sometimes when he was working in shirt sleeves, and the sun was at a certain angle. He didn't think about it much. He'd had worse and hadn't thought about those much either. What he did think about in the weeks that followed was harder to name. The shape of the days at Briar Hollow had changed since the fire. Not dramatically, the work was the same work, the schedule was the same schedule. But the quality of things was different. The silences between him and Clara had shifted in the way that silences shift between people who've been through something together and come out the other side. They weren't the careful silences of 2 people measuring each other anymore. They were something more comfortable than that. Though comfortable wasn't quite the right word, it was more that the measuring had reached some kind of conclusion, and they'd both moved on to a different phase without formally announcing it. She still didn't tell him when she was worried about something. But she'd started asking his opinion on things that weren't strictly his department cattle breeding decisions, whether to fence the south corner of the east pasture, whether the note payment should be sent by courier or delivered in person. Small things. The kind of things you ask another person when you've started factoring their perspective into your own thinking. He noticed it and said nothing about it, because saying something about it would have made it into a thing, and making it into a thing would have made it awkward. And it wasn't awkward. It was just how things had gotten. He'd also started noticing things about her that had nothing to do with the ranch. The way she read in the evenings, not lazily, but with her whole attention, like reading was something she took seriously. The way she talked to the horses, not in the cutesy way, some people talk to horses, but in the same level. Direct tone she used with everyone, as if she considered the horse a competent entity that deserved straight information. The way she laughed rarely, briefly, and always at something that actually earned it, never as a social gesture, which meant that when it happened it was real and it landed differently than most laughter did. He wasn't falling in love with her. He told himself this clearly and believed it, mostly. He was 53 years old. He knew the difference between caring about someone and falling in love with them, and he also knew that the line between those two things was not always as clean as you wanted it to be. He kept that thought in a drawer in the back of his mind and didn't open the drawer very often. He focused on the fence work. The fence work was straightforward. The fence work did not require him to examine anything. The first frost warning came to Red Willow Crossing from the north on a September morning when Silas was replacing the last section of the west fence. He could feel it in the air before he saw it, that particular sharp edge to the wind that meant the season was ending whether anyone was ready for it or not. He drove the final post and was tamping the base when he heard the horse coming. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the tamp 3 good strikes with the digger handle and then stood and turned. It was not a horse he recognized. A good-looking bay with expensive tack, ridden by a man in his late 50s, who sat a horse the way men sat horses when they'd been doing it so long. It was less something they did, and more something they were. The man rode up to the fence line and stopped. Silas had never met Gideon Varick face to face. He'd seen him once at a distance in town. Before the fire, a big man with the kind of authority that came from decades of being the largest thing in any room. Up close, he was exactly what Silas had constructed in his mind from the evidence. Carefully dressed, unhurried, with pale gray eyes that had the quality of a man who'd learned to look at things without being read in return. Varick looked at the new fence section. He looked at the west pasture behind it, still bare and stubbled from the fire, though the grass was starting to come back at the margins, the way burned ground always did. He looked at the corrected boundary markers that Silas had reset after the fire, driven deeper into the ground than before. Then he looked at Silas. "Rourke," he said. He said it simply, as a statement, the way you say someone's name when you already know it and want them to know you know it. "Varick," Silas said in exactly the same tone. A silence fell between them. Not a hostile one, something more considered than that. 2 men looking at each other across a fence line that had meant something different 3 months ago than it meant today, deciding what this conversation was going to be. "The west pasture's going to come back slower than you'd like," Varick said. "Late fire burns usually need 2 full seasons before the root systems are right again." "I know," Silas said. "You'll have to supplement the hay longer than you planned." "We've arranged that." Varick looked at the fence post Silas had just finished setting. It was solid work. Silas didn't see any point in doing it otherwise, and Varick was clearly a man who could read fence work the same way Silas could read cattle records. "You drove those markers deeper," Varick said. "The boundary markers." "Yes, smart," he said it without any particular inflection. Like he was noting a chess move. Hard to lose track of a post that's 3 feet in the ground. Silas waited. Varick adjusted slightly in the saddle. Not nervously, the man didn't appear to do anything nervously. More like a man resettling his weight before he says something that required him to be balanced. "I've been in this county for 22 years, he said. "I came here with $400 and a small herd, and I built something. I'm not ashamed of that." He paused. "But somewhere in the building of it, I started looking at every acre around me as something I needed to have. Not wanted. Needed." He looked at the creek. which was visible from where they stood, running clear in the September morning. That's a different thing. That's a harder thing to live with than people expect. Silas didn't respond. He wanted to hear where this went before he said anything. I knew about the Harmon survey error, Varick said. He said it plainly, without the softening that a lesser man might have tried to apply to it. I found it 4 years ago when I hired my own surveyor to look at the water rights situation. I didn't do anything about it right away, because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do about it. Tom Whitlock was sick. I thought he stopped. I told myself I was waiting to see how things settled. That's what I told myself. But you were actually waiting to see if you could use it, Silas said. Not accusatory, just stating what they both knew. Varick looked at him with those flat gray eyes. Yes, he said. That's more accurate. Another silence. A crow flew over the fence line and didn't stop. I can't prove you ordered that fire, Silas said. He said it calmly because he'd been thinking about this conversation for 6 weeks and he knew exactly how he wanted to have it. I'm not going to try. What I am going to tell you is what you may not have fully understood when you were planning for Clara Whitlock to reach her limit and give up. Varick waited. She survived her husband's death alone, Silas said. She survived the bank refusing her 4 times. She survived 60 days with a note hanging over her head and a neighbor she couldn't trust watching her every time she went into town. She cut a fire break by herself, in the dark, with a plow horse, and she stood at that break and beat out a spot fire with a wet feed sack, and she didn't move until it was done. He picked up his digger and set it over his shoulder. Whatever version of Clara Whitlock you were accounting for when you made your plans, the version who was going to get tired and give up and sell you what you wanted, that version doesn't exist. You've been patient for 3 years waiting for a woman to break who isn't going to break. Varick listened to all of this without expression. When Silas finished, he was quiet for a moment. And you, he said. What are you? What's Silas Rourke in this picture? Silas had expected some version of this question. He'd thought about the answer. I'm not moving on, he said, if that's what you're asking. I'm not another hired hand who'll be somewhere else by spring. I'm on the deed. I'm in the bank papers. I'm in the ground here the same as those markers. He looked at the fence post he'd just driven. I'm going to be here when you decide your approach needs to change. I'm going to be here when whoever those 2 men on the ridge were have long since moved on to someone else's problems. I'm going to be here in 5 years and 10 years, and every time you look at this fence line, you're going to see it. Varick looked at the fence post for a long moment. He was quiet in the way of a man doing real thinking, not stalling, not performing, but genuinely working through something. Silas had learned to recognize the difference. When Varick spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but the quality of the authority in it had shifted less like the weight of a man who believes he's going to win, and more like the weight of a man who has decided something. The creek access, he said. My cattle need that water in the dry months. The section that's on your land now under the corrected survey. I know they do, Silas said. What does that cost? Silas looked at him for a moment. This was not the direction he'd expected. He'd prepared for denial, deflection, veiled threats, more patience. He hadn't prepared for a direct question about terms. I don't speak for Clara on that, he said. You'd have to come to the ranch and have that conversation with her directly. Something crossed Varick's face, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. Like a man who'd been operating at one altitude being told he needed to descend. That's fair, he said. It is, Silas said. Varick looked at the burned western pasture one more time. He looked at the markers. He looked at the new fence section. I'll ride over, he said. All right. Varick turned the bay and started south along the fence line, then stopped. He half-turned in the saddle. The fire, he said. Silas waited. I didn't order it, Varick said. He said it without adding anything to it, no elaboration, no defense, no anger at the implication. Just the statement laid flat. Silas looked at him. He didn't know if it was true. He thought about it and decided he didn't need to know. What mattered was where they were standing right now, and where the fence line was, and what the papers said, and what Varick had just agreed to. All right, Silas said. Varick rode south. Silas watched him go. Then he went back to finishing the fence line. He told Clara that evening. He did not build up to it or frame it carefully. He simply told her, the same way he told her everything at the kitchen table. After supper, directly. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup in the way she did when she was thinking hard. When he finished, she said, "He's coming to talk about water access." That's what he said. He wants a deal. Sounds that way. She was quiet for a moment. 3 years of all of it. And now he wants to sit at my table and talk about a deal. Yes, Silas said. That's what it looks like. She looked at her coffee. She set the cup down. She looked at the window, which was dark now, the September night pressing against it. And you believe him? About the fire? I don't know, Silas said honestly. And I don't think it changes what our move is either way. She considered this. He waited. She had a right to the time. What do we want? She said. If he comes here and he wants to talk terms, what do we want? You tell me, Silas said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not because it was guarded. She'd stopped being guarded with him sometime around, the week after the fire, somewhere between beating out the spot fire and leading Walker back from the creek bank in the early morning, but because it was complicated. Several things at once. I want what Tom wanted, she said finally. I want this ranch to be solid. Fences up, note paid. Cattle healthy. Water secured, she paused. I don't want a feud. Feuds cost money, and they cost something harder to name than money, and I've got enough already that I can't afford to spend. So a water access agreement, Silas said, formal. Filed with the county. Varick's cattle can use the deep pool section in dry months. In return, he acknowledges the corrected boundary in writing, Clara said, in front of a land attorney. On record, not a handshake, not a verbal agreement. On record. That's what I'd ask for too, Silas said. She nodded once, with that decisiveness he'd known from the first day. When he comes, I'll hear him out, she said. But those are the terms. Puts it on record or there's no deal. He'll agree to that, Silas said. He didn't say it as a prediction. He said it as the conclusion of several weeks of thinking about what Gideon Varick actually needed versus what he'd been trying to take. Clara looked at him. You sound confident. He needs that water, Silas said. He's a practical man. Practical men make practical agreements when the alternative is that the thing they need goes away. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. Were you afraid that night? On the ridge. He thought about that. He thought about riding toward 2 men he didn't know in the orange dark with smoke in his lungs and the mare still wound up from the fire. Not afraid exactly, he said. I knew what I was going to say. When you know what you're going to say and you know it's the truth and you know it doesn't leave room for the other person to do anything useful, it's less about fear and more about whether you can say it right. She looked at him. And could you? They left, he said. So I guess so. She almost smiled. That brief, real thing that happened and was gone before you could be sure of it. Silas, she said. Yeah. She looked at her hands on the table, then back up. This started as a legal arrangement. You know that. I don't want you to think I've forgotten that, or that I'm taking for granted what you've. Clara, he said. She stopped. I know what this started as, he said. I was there. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He looked at the table, at Tom's ledgers stacked at the edge of it, at the lamp burning between them. But I'll tell you something. I've worked on a lot of ranches. And this is the first time I've fixed a fence and thought about it in the morning. He paused. The first time I've given a damn what the weather does in September. The first time he stopped, because the next thing was harder to say. The first time I've known what I was going home to. Kitchen was quiet. The lamp burned between them. Outside, September moved through the Kansas grass with the slow insistence of a season that had work to do and was getting on with it. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, That's the first time you've said that. Said what? Home, she said it simply. You said home. He hadn't noticed. He thought about it now. He had said it, without thinking about it, without deciding to. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Clara picked up her coffee cup. She looked at the window. Varick comes, she said, back to the practical tone she used when she was settled on something, we hear him out. We set the terms. We file it on record. Then we're done with that chapter. And then, Silas said. She stood up and carried her cup to the sink. At the window, she paused and looked out at the dark pasture, east pasture, where the cattle were, where the grass was still good, where the fence line ran straight and solid all the way to the creek. Then we do what we've been doing, she said. We run the ranch. She turned from the window. She met his eyes across the kitchen. Together, she said. Not like a romantic declaration. Not with softness in it, just the word, plain and direct and certain, the way she said every true thing. It was enough. It was more than enough. He nodded. She said good night and went down the hall. Silas sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, in the lamplight, with Tom's ledgers at the edge of the table, and the wind moving outside and the cattle quiet in the east pasture. He thought about 30 years of moving. He thought about the Strickland foreman shaking his hand. He thought about sleeping in bunkhouses where nobody knew his name by the second week. He thought about riding into Red Willow Crossing with $4 and a letter nobody had asked to read. He thought about what it felt like to drive a fence post into ground that was yours, the sound it made, the way the echo came back. He sat there until the lamp needed trimming. Then he got up and went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, sleep came without any waiting at all. Varick came on a Tuesday morning, 12 days after Silas had met him at the fence line. He rode alone, which Silas noted. A man who wanted to make a show of power brought people. A man who had decided something came by himself. Varick tied his bay at the post outside the barn and walked to the front porch without hurrying, and Silas watched him from the doorway of the barn and thought that whatever else you could say about Gideon Varick, he was not a man who did things he hadn't already finished thinking through. Clara met him on the porch. Silas had asked her that morning whether she wanted him in the room for the conversation or outside it, and she'd thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, not just reflexively deciding, and said, "In the room. Table. But let me lead it." Understood, he'd said, and that had been the end of that. She didn't offer Varick coffee. She showed him to the kitchen table and sat across from him and put her hands flat on the surface in the way she did when she was settled and ready, and she looked at him with the steady, clear attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. Varick looked around the kitchen once at the ledgers on the side table, at the maps Clara had left out deliberately, at the lamp even though it was morning and the lamp was unlit, and then he looked at Clara, and he seemed to understand that she had arranged this room the way she'd arranged the conversation, and that there wasn't going to be any preamble. "I want to talk about the creek access," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Silas told me what you said at the fence line." Varick glanced at Silas, who was sitting to Clara's left and slightly back from the table present, as he'd said, but positioned so it was clear whose table this was. Varick gave a single nod, like he was acknowledging a piece of correct information, and looked back at Clara. "The deep pool section," he said. "My cattle need it in July and August when the upper creek runs low. That's been the case for 8 years. It'll be the case for as long as I run cattle on this land." "I know that too," Clara said. "What do you want for access?" Clara looked at him for a moment, not the considering look she used when she was still working something out she'd worked this out days ago. This was a different look, the look of a woman who wanted to make sure the man across from her understood the weight of what he was about to agree to. "I want the corrected boundary acknowledged in writing," she said, "in front of Edward Cass, who conducted the survey, and in front of a land attorney. I want that document filed with the county recorder. Not a handshake, not a letter filed." Varick said nothing. "In exchange for that," Clara continued, "you have legal access to the deep pool section for your cattle every year, between June 15th and September 15th. You're responsible for any damage your cattle do to the bank. You give us 48 hours notice before you move a herd through, and the agreement is reviewed every 5 years. She stopped. She waited. Varick looked at the table for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands, once the only gesture of anything other than complete control that Silas had seen from him, and then he set the hat down. 5-year review, he said. That's unusual. It's mine, Clara said. If your use of the access changes, if you expand your herd significantly, If there's drought damage to the bank, if the terms need adjusting, I want a mechanism to revisit it without a legal fight. 5 years is reasonable. Varric looked at her. Something moved in those gray eyes, not admiration exactly, but something in its neighborhood. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man seeing something he'd miscalculated. All right, he said. Clara didn't visibly react to this. She'd expected him to agree, and he had, and that was that. I'll have the attorney draw it up, she said. Cass will provide the survey documentation. I'd like this done before the first frost. That's 2 weeks, Varric said. I know how long it is until the first frost, Clara said. Another silence. Varric looked down at his hat. He picked it up and held it. Mrs. Rourke, he said. He said the name with a kind of careful correctness, like a man making sure he used the right word for something. I owe you an apology. Clara's expression didn't change. She waited. Not for any specific thing I'm admitting to, he said. There was no particular deflection in this. It was a precise legal statement from a precise man. But for 3 years of pressure on a woman who was managing grief and a ranch and a debt and doing it without any of the advantages I had. He paused. That wasn't fair, and I knew it wasn't fair while I was doing it. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Silas watched her and thought about all the things she could have said, all the things she had earned the right to say, about the 4 trips to the bank, about the ham, about standing at the firebreak in the dark with her arms shaking and the smoke in her lungs. She said, "The attorney's office is in Caldwell. I'll send you the date when it's arranged." That was all she said. Varric nodded. He picked up his hat. He looked at Silas. "Rourke," he said. "Varric," Silas said. Varric walked out of the kitchen, across the porch, and down to his horse. They heard the bay moving down the drive, and then the sound faded, and the morning settled back into its ordinary sounds, the cattle in the east pasture, the wind in the grass, Walker shifting his weight in the corral. Clara sat at the table with her hands still flat on the surface. Silas waited. After a while, she said, "He's going to honor it." "Yes," Silas said. "Not because he's sorry," she said. "Because he's practical. Both can be true," Silas said. "Practical men sometimes get to sorry, eventually. It just takes them longer." She looked at her hands. She pressed them flat, one more time, the way she'd pressed them against her apron the day. Varric had ridden through her gate and looked down at her, like she was something he'd already purchased. And then she lifted them off the table and let them rest in her lap. "All right," she said, "let's get back to work." The agreement was signed and filed on a Thursday morning in Caldwell, in the office of a land attorney named Bertram Cole, who had a large mustache and a very organized desk, and who completed the transaction with the cheerful efficiency of a man who found straightforward legal work genuinely satisfying. Edward Cass was present and signed the survey documentation with the same flat expression he'd worn when he'd told Silas the boundary was 73 yards further west than anyone had believed. Varric signed without ceremony. Clara signed last, in her careful, unhurried handwriting, and Silas watched her hand move across the paper and thought about Tom Whitlock's note folded between 2 pages of a cattle ledger, and how long it had taken for that unfinished thought to become this. Bertram Cole stamped everything and made copies and put them in 3 separate files, in 3 separate locations in his very organized office, and then he shook hands all around with the professional warmth of a man who had just made everyone in the room safer and knew it. They drove back to Briar Hollow, mostly in silence, which was their way. The October sky was doing something remarkable, the particular high, cold blue that only happened in Kansas in early fall, when the summer haze was gone and the air was clear enough to feel like you could see to the edge of the territory. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow. The burned western pasture, still mostly bare, but starting to show the first pale green of new grass at the margins, looked almost deliberate in the fall light, like the land was showing its working. About 2 miles from home, Clara said, Tom would have liked him. Silas glanced at her. Cass, she said, Tom liked methodical people. People who didn't waste words, she paused. He would have driven Cass absolutely crazy asking questions, though. Tom asked a lot of questions about things he didn't understand. It's not a bad quality, Silas said. No, she said. It wasn't. She was looking at the road. He wasn't a perfect man. He was stubborn about the wrong things sometimes. He held grudges too long. He would not admit when he was in pain because he thought it was a weakness, which is something I only understood after he was gone, and couldn't argue about it anymore. Silas listened, but he built something, she said. He built something and he wanted it to last, and he spent his whole life trying to make it worth lasting. She paused again. I think that's enough. I think that's actually enough for a life. I think so too, Silas said. She nodded once and didn't say anything more about Tom after that, and Silas understood that something had completed itself, not ended, but completed. The way a sentence completes when you find the last word you were looking for. They got home and unhitched the wagon and got back to work, and that was right too. The first frost came on a Saturday night, earlier than the almanac had predicted, and later than Silas's bones had been telling him for a week. He woke to the white-touched grass and the particular stillness of a morning after frost, everything quiet, everything clarified, and he stood on the bunkroom step and breathed the cold air and felt the season turning over underneath him like a wheel finding its next position. The western pasture had surprised him. He'd told Clara it would come back greener, because that was what burned ground did, and he'd been right, but he hadn't been prepared for how much ground had come back or how fast. By early October, there was new grass across more than half of the burned section, not tall enough to graze yet, but real and dense. The kind of root-deep growth that came from soil that had been cleared down to nothing and was rebuilding from the bottom up. By next summer, he thought, you might not be able to tell there'd been a fire at all. He'd noticed this about burned things before. The ones that survived the fire and kept their roots in the ground tended to come back harder than they'd been before. It wasn't always true. Sometimes the fire was too much and the roots died and nothing came back but weeds. But when the roots held, when the thing underneath survived, the regrowth had a quality that the original growth hadn't had. Like the burning had taken out everything that was just taking up space. He thought about this more than he told Clara. He thought it was probably true about more than grass. The cattle were in good condition going into winter, better than he'd projected in July, when the fire had made everything look more precarious than it turned out to be. The hay from Tom's cousin and Selena had covered the gap in the western pasture without depleting their reserves, and the fall grazing had been strong enough that they'd be going into the cold months with a herd that was heavier than last year's record by a margin that would matter at spring market. Silas had worked through the numbers 3 times because he didn't trust good news the first time he heard it or the second, but by the 3rd calculation, he was confident. He told Clara on a Tuesday evening, the numbers laid out in the ledger between them. She looked at them carefully. She ran her finger down the column the way she always did. She looked at it long enough that he started to wonder if he'd made an error. This is right, she said. Far as I can tell, he said. Run it yourself if you want. She did. Not because she doubted him, he understood that, but because she was the kind of person who needed to hold a true thing in her own hands before she could trust it fully. And he respected that because it was how he was too. She finished the calculation and set the pencil down. The note, she said. 2 payments left, he said. At this margin, we can make the January payment and the March payment and still have operating reserves going into planting. She looked at the ledger for a moment longer. Then she closed it. We should make the January payment early, she said. Before the end of the year. I want it on record that we paid early. He looked at her. Purcell. I want Gerald Purcell to write the receipt himself, she said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction, something drier and more specific than satisfaction. The feeling of watching a particular door close permanently. I want him to write the amount and the date and sign his name and hand it to me across his desk. We can do that, Silas said. She nodded. She stood and carried the ledger back to the side table where it lived. Silas, she said, with her back to him, returning the book to its place. Yeah. She turned around. She was leaning against the side table with her arms loosely crossed, and she was looking at him with an expression he'd learned to read over the past months. The expression she was, for longer than the conversation, something she'd think about longer than the conversation suggested. I've been going through the accounts, she said. All of them. Operating expenses, payroll, supplies. She paused. Your wages, he said nothing. You've taken almost none of it, she said. He still said nothing. She reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a small account book separate from the main ledger, the one she used for payroll. She opened it and held it so he could see. His column was nearly empty. Month after month, the wages she'd agreed to were entered on the left side of the page. And on the right side, where the withdrawals should have been, there were almost no entries. Where did it go? She said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't even. I tracked the expenses, the fence wire in July, that was you. The extra hay in August, the 2 weeks before Tom's cousin's supply came in, that was you. The well pipe fittings, the replacement pulley, the digger bit we rented in June. She set the book down on the table between them. You've been putting your wages back into the ranch, she said. For months. He looked at the book, he looked at the window. He looked at his hands. Ranch needed it, he said. Silas. She said his name the way she said it when she needed him to actually hear her rather than respond. That was your money. Agreed wages. I know what was agreed, he said. I'm not confused about the agreement. Then why? Because I didn't need it, he said. He said it simply, without defense in it. I've got no debt, no family, no place I needed money for. The ranch needed fence wire. I had money that was sitting there. He paused. It wasn't complicated. She looked at him for a long time. It was a lot of money, she said. It was, he agreed. You could have told me. You would have argued about it, he said. Yes, she said immediately, and something about the immediacy of it, the fact that she didn't even try to deny it, made him almost smile. I would have, because that's your money, Silas. You earned it. I spent it on something I wanted to spend it on, he said. That's generally what earning money is for. She looked at him. She pressed her lips together in that way she had when she was trying to decide if she was angry or not and hadn't reached a conclusion yet. What did you want to spend it on, she said. Her voice was quieter now. Not soft. Clara's voice rarely went fully soft, but quieter. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about 30 years of spending his wages on bunkhouse fees and replacement tack and the occasional meal in a town he was passing through. Money that went into things that didn't last and didn't accumulate into anything. He thought about the fence wire running tight and straight along the western boundary. He thought about the well, the water coming up cold and reliable from 38 feet down. He thought about the pasture pipe carrying water to the cattle tank without anyone having to haul. Something that stays, he said. Something that'll be here next year and the year after. Something that he stopped because the next part was harder and he wasn't entirely sure he could say it right. I've spent 30 years building things for other people. Their fences, their wells, their cattle, and they were fine things. Solid work. But when I moved on, the work stayed and I left. And those two facts had nothing to do with each other. The work didn't know me. The land didn't know I'd been there. He looked at the account book on the table. I wanted to spend money on something that knew. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara stood at the side table looking at him with an expression that was complicated in a way that her expressions rarely were. She was generally a clear person, a person whose face said one thing at a time, but this was layered. He saw things move through it that he recognized from his own internal landscape, something old and tired recognizing something it had stopped expecting to find. She picked up the account book. She looked at it for a moment. Then she walked to the stove, lifted the iron lid, and dropped the account book into the fire. He stared at her. Clara, the wages are done, she said. She replaced the lid. She turned around and looked at him with an expression that was clearer now. Clear and certain, the way she looked when she'd made a decision that she intended to live with. There's no employer and no employee and no payroll to track anymore. We need to redo the ranch papers. The deed papers are all ready. Not just the deed, she said. Everything. Operating agreement, decision authority, financial arrangement. All of it reflects what this actually is, not what it started as. She came back to the table and sat down across from him. You put your wages into this ranch because you stopped thinking of yourself as a hired hand somewhere along the way. I want the papers to catch up with that fact. He looked at her. He thought about the morning in this same kitchen 4 months ago when she'd asked him to marry her with her hands flat on the table, and her voice level, and her eyes holding his without flinching. "That'll take some legal work," he said. "Bertram Cole seemed efficient," she said. "We'll go back to Caldwell." "Clara." "What?" He looked at her for a moment. He wasn't a man who said difficult things easily. He'd spent most of his life in situations where saying the difficult thing was either not useful or not safe, and that kind of long practice left marks. But he said it anyway, because she'd earned the truth and because not saying true things was a habit he'd decided to stop carrying somewhere around the second week of fence work. "You know this started as an arrangement," he said. "You said it yourself, a legal situation, practical." "I know what I said," she said. "I'm not asking to change what it is," he said. "I'm asking I need to know if what it is has changed." "Not the papers. The actual thing." He stopped. "Because from where I'm sitting, it's changed. It's changed considerably. But I don't want to tell you what's changed on your side. That's yours." The lamp between them burned steady and quiet. Clara looked at him for a long time, long enough that he heard the fire settle in the stove and the wind change direction outside and one of the horses shift weight in the corral. "When you rode back into the fire," she said, "for the cattle. Through that gap." "Yeah," he said, "I was at the creek bank." "I didn't know where you were. The smoke was too thick." She paused. "I stood there, and I thought if he doesn't come back, what do I do?" She said it factually, like she was reporting something she'd observed from a distance. "And I realized that what I was feeling wasn't about the cattle or the ranch or the legal situation. It was just about you not coming back." He didn't say anything. "That was August," she said. "I've had 2 months to decide what to do with that information." And he said. She looked at him. The expression on her face was the clearest he'd ever seen it, not simplified, but clarified. The way things go when you've been thinking about them long enough that all the complicated parts have settled into their right places. "And the papers need to reflect what this actually is," she said, was all she said. It was enough. It was in the particular language of Clara Whitlock, everything. He nodded. She nodded. They sat at the table for a while longer and talked about the January bank payment and the spring cattle schedule and the fence sections that would need attention before the deep cold came. And it was the most ordinary conversation in the world. And it was also not ordinary at all. And both of those things were true at the same time in a way that felt exactly right. They went to Caldwell twice more before Christmas. The first time was for the early bank payment. Gerald Purcell wrote the receipt himself, as Clara had wanted, and signed his name and handed it across the desk. And Clara took it from him and folded it into her coat pocket without making anything of it. But in the wagon on the way home, she took it out and looked at it once and then put it back, and Silas didn't say anything about that. The second time was for Bertram Cole. It took the better part of a morning. Cole drew up the amended operating agreement and the revised deed language and the financial arrangement that reflected equal partnership across every category, and he was thorough and correct and efficient about all of it in his organized way. He didn't comment on what they were doing or why. He just did the legal work and presented it for signing and stamped everything and made copies and filed what needed filing. When they were done, Cole shook Silas's hand and then Clara's hand and said, "Congratulations," in a tone that, unlike Aldous Briggs in the Red Willow Crossing courthouse 7 months ago, actually meant it. On the way home from the second Caldwell trip, the sky was doing something different than the October blue. It was the harder, flatter gray of a Kansas December sky that meant serious weather was building somewhere north and would arrive when it arrived and not before. The cottonwoods along the creek had lost their leaves and were bare and dark against the gray, and the grass was frost-pale, and the land had taken on the particular stripped quality of late fall that Silas had always found honest. This was the land without its summer clothes. This was what it actually was. He'd come to love this part of the year in Kansas, in the particular way you love a hard thing that you've made your peace with. He hadn't always. He'd spent 30 years tolerating Kansas winters as something to get through, something between one cattle season and the next. But that was when Kansas winter meant a bunkhouse that wasn't quite warm enough, and food that wasn't quite good enough, and the low-level loneliness of a man who has nowhere specific to be when the work stops. It meant something different now, Cole's going to tell someone, Clara said about a mile from home. Probably, Silas said. Small towns. Let them talk, she said. She said it the same way she'd said it on their wedding day, not with bravado, just with the simple, clear confidence of a woman who'd made her decisions and was done justifying them. He looked at her sideways. You've gotten a lot better at that, he said. What, letting them talk? She thought about this. I've had some practice this year, she said, and that was as close as Clara Whitlock ever came to understatement. Winter came and settled over Briar Hollow with the serious intent that Kansas winters brought, and they met it the way they met everything practically. Together, without pretending it was anything other than what it was. The cattle were solid. The hay reserves held. The second well, the one Silas had broken through the limestone shelf to finish, ran clear and reliable even in the deep cold weeks when the original well had always given trouble. The western fence stood straight and tight, new posts still pale in the winter light. Burned western pasture lay under its first snow and rested, and underneath the snow the new root systems were doing the quiet, invisible work that grass roots do in cold months, spreading, deepening, setting up for what came next. Pete came by twice to help with heavy work, and ate at the main table both times, and ate like a man who'd been working outside in December, which he had. And Clara fed him without ceremony, and paid him what he'd earned, and sent him home with a jar of preserves for his mother, which was not ceremonious either, but which Pete clearly understood as something meaningful, because he said thank you twice, which was once more than usual. They'd been getting occasional visitors from Red Willow Crossing since the fire. Not many, and not the kind of visitors who came for social reasons. Ranching people in that country didn't do social visits in winter, but the practical kind. A neighbor who wanted to discuss whether Briar Hollow would be interested in a shared fence line on the north boundary, which would save both operations money. A man from the feed store who was extending credit arrangements and wanted to know their spring hay needs. A woman named Frances, who lived alone on a small operation 2 miles south and who came ostensibly to return a borrowed tool but who stayed for coffee, and talked to Clara for an hour about grazing rights and left in noticeably better spirits than she'd arrived in. The isolation that had defined Briar Hollow for 14 months, the isolation of a widow on a struggling property, that the county had collectively decided to feel sorry for, in a way that kept a careful distance, had broken. It had broken the way these things break. Not in one moment, not with any announcement, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that this was a place that was going to keep going, managed by people who were going to be here, and that changed how the surrounding world oriented itself toward it. Silas understood this. He'd seen it happen to ranches before. There was a quality that struggling operations had something uncertain in the air, something that made the people around them hold at a slight remove, the way you hold at a slight remove from a thing that might fall and take you with it. And when that quality went away, when the uncertainty cleared and the ground felt solid again, people moved in closer. Not out of sentiment, just because solid things were easier to build beside than uncertain things. Briar Hollow felt solid now. He felt it himself. He felt it in the way he got up in the morning, in the way the day organized itself around work that was his work, decisions that were his decisions, a place that was his place. He still had moments of something he couldn't quite name, not doubt, but a kind of wonderment at the fact of where he'd ended up. He'd come to Red Willow Crossing with $4 and a worn-out saddle, and he'd been planning to stay a season. He'd planned to spend another winter being useful somewhere and belonging nowhere, and then move on when spring came, the way he'd spent 30 springs. The plan had not survived contact with the situation. He thought about this sometimes. In the way you think about the things that changed the direction of everything, not with drama, not as a story with a moral, but with the plain, slightly disoriented recognition that life had done something he hadn't expected it to do, and that the something was better than what he'd been heading toward when it happened. He thought about what he might say if someone had asked him, back in Abilene, being handed his walking papers by a foreman whose name he couldn't even bring himself to remember now, where do you think you'll end up? He wouldn't have said Kansas. He wouldn't have said a ranch that needed everything at once. He wouldn't have said a courthouse in a small settlement with a crack in the east wall and a justice of the peace who'd lost his reading glasses. He wouldn't have said any of the specific things that had added up to this, because you couldn't see the specific things from back there. You could only see where you were standing. This was where he was standing. In late January, after the early bank payment had cleared and the receipt was filed and the note had only one payment left, Clara found something she hadn't known she was going to find. She was reorganizing the financial files. She did this periodically, with the same systematic approach she brought to the cattle records and the grazing rotations, and she found, in the back of the third drawer of Tom's desk, a small envelope she'd never opened because it had been mixed in with old receipts, and she'd assumed it was another old receipt. It wasn't. It was a note from Tom. Not a business note. The handwriting was different from the ledger entries. The same rougher hand as the survey note Silas had found between the cattle pages, the voice Tom used when he was writing to himself or to someone specific. This one was addressed on the outside to no one. Just C in Tom's writing, which was what he'd called her. She sat at the desk and read it. She didn't tell Silas what it said, not right away, and he didn't ask. He noticed she'd been quiet through supper, and that she'd gone back to the desk after supper instead of to the chair where she usually read, and he noticed that she held herself slightly differently, not worse, not better, but with the particular quality of someone who has just received information that has settled something that was previously unsettled. Later she came and sat down across from him at the kitchen table. She put the envelope on the table between them. He knew, she said. Silas waited. Not specifically. Not the survey, not the fire, not any of it specifically. But he knew something was wrong with the western boundary, and he knew he was running out of time to fix it, and she stopped. She put her hand on the envelope. He said he hoped someone would come along to finish what he'd started. He said that to me. To see in a note he apparently put in a drawer and never gave me. She looked at the envelope. He must have been meaning to give it to me, and then not knowing when, and then running out of when. Silas said nothing. There was nothing right to say. He said he wasn't worried about the land, she said. He said the land knew how to take care of itself if you paid attention to it. He said he was worried about me being alone, because I didn't. She stopped again. He said I didn't know how not to be alone, and that it was the one thing in 30 years he'd never been able to teach me. Silas looked at her. She looked at him. He wasn't wrong, she said quietly. I didn't know how. I'm not entirely sure I know now. But I know it's different than it was. Yes, Silas said. It is. She folded the envelope carefully and put it in her coat pocket near the bank receipt. She sat for a moment. Thank you, she said. The two words came out with a weight that was disproportionate to their size, the way two-word things sometimes are when they're carrying everything that didn't fit into the longer conversations. Clara, don't say it was nothing, she said. It wasn't nothing. Don't make it smaller than it is. He didn't. He just nodded, and she nodded back, and they sat in the lamplight for a while and let the evening do what evenings did. The last fence post of the western boundary went in on a Thursday afternoon in late February, the final piece of a repair project that had started the morning after the fire and worked its way north through the fall and into the winter whenever the ground wasn't too hard to dig. Silas drove it himself. Clara had offered to help, and he'd said he had it, and she'd looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes that meant she suspected he had a reason for wanting to do this particular thing alone, and she'd gone back to the house without pressing it. The day was cold but clear, the kind of February day in Kansas that reminded you winter wasn't permanent, a blue sky with no ceiling to it running all the way out to the flat horizon in every direction. The creek was running well, swollen slightly with snowmelt from the north, and from where he was standing he could see the deep pool section, their section now, undisputed, filed, signed, and standing in 3 sets of records in 3 separate offices catching the winter sun on its surface. He set the post. He drove it deep, the way he always drove them, with the 3 strikes he used when he wanted to know the post was solid all the way down. The first strike settled it. The second struck confirmed it. The third was the one he always used to check his work. You could hear the difference between a post that was right and a post that still had movement in it. This one was right. He struck it the third time and listened to the sound roll out across the creek through the pale winter pasture and back toward the house. He'd driven thousands of fence posts in 30 years. In Texas and Oklahoma and Colorado and 3 other territories he could name, and a few he'd passed through so quickly they'd never stuck in his memory. He'd driven posts in rain and heat, and once in a hailstorm on a cattle drive where the foreman had needed the fence up before morning and hadn't been interested in what the weather was doing about it. He'd driven posts in ground that belonged to other men. Always in ground that belonged to other men. That had been the only ground there was for 30 years, other men's, all of it, and the posts he drove had stayed when he left, and the land had not noticed either way. The echo came back. It came off the creek bank, and off the stand of cottonwoods on the far side, and off the stone outcropping that marked the north corner of the property, and it arrived back to him with the particular quality of sound that knows where it came from. He stood there for a moment with the digger handle in his hand and let the echo go where it went. He wasn't a sentimental man. He'd told himself that for 30 years and believed it, mostly. But he understood now that there was a difference between not being sentimental and not allowing yourself to feel the weight of things, and that he'd been doing both of those as if they were the same thing, which they weren't. This was his ground, his posts, his creek, his echo, his home. He'd said it in August, without thinking about it, and Clara had noticed before he did. And since then the word had been inside all the ordinary days, not loudly, not with drama, just present the way real things are present. Quietly, underneath everything, holding the weight. He picked up his tools. He looked west one more time at the creek and the pool and the boundary markers standing clean and clear in the winter light. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. Smoke was coming from the chimney. The crack in the mortar had been repaired in November, properly this time, with the right material and a full repoint instead of a rag stuffed in a gap. The kitchen lamp was already on in the late afternoon winter light, a yellow square in the gray face of the house. He came up the porch steps, the ones that had been replaced in October with sound lumber, and he opened the door. Clara was at the stove. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. "Last one," she said. "Last one," he said. She turned around then. She looked at him with that clear, level look, the same look she'd had across the kitchen table 7 months ago when she'd asked him, plainly and without decoration, if he'd marry her. And he'd looked at her ranch falling apart around her and seen something in it worth fighting for. He'd thought then that he was seeing the ranch. He understood now he'd been seeing her. "Come eat," she said. "It's cold out." He hung his coat. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table where Tom's ledgers still lived at the edge, and where his own handwriting now lived alongside Clara's in the margins and the new entries, and where the lamp burned between them the same as it always had. Outside, February held the Kansas prairie in its flat, honest grip, and the creek ran, and the cattle moved in the east pasture, and the new grass was already doing its invisible work under the frost, getting ready for spring. Briar Hollow sat in the middle of all of it and held. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect. The chimney was repaired, but the mortar would need checking every year. The east fence had 2 posts that were marginal and would need replacing before summer. The banknote had 1 payment left and then it was done. But done didn't mean easy, and easy wasn't what either of them had signed up for. The ground was theirs, and the water was theirs, and the work was theirs. And they were in it together in a way that had started as a legal arrangement and become something that no document had language for, the kind of thing that happens when 2 people in difficult circumstances choose each other again and again in the small ordinary moments that don't feel like choices but are. Silas Rourke had spent 30 years being useful everywhere and belonging nowhere, and he had arrived at a place that kept him, not because the place was easy, not because everything had worked out neatly, but because he'd stayed when it got hard, and she'd stayed when it got hard, and the staying had built something that the starting never could have built alone. That was the whole of it. Some things you don't find by looking for them. You find them by doing the next right thing in front of you, fixing the fence, driving the well, standing at the fire break in the dark, and one day you look up and you're somewhere you belong. and the echo of your own work is coming back to you from every direction. He ate supper with his wife at their kitchen table, in their house, on their land. The lamp burned steady between them. Outside, Kansas went on being itself enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way of places that don't care whether you stay or go, that simply are, and wait to see what you'll make of them. Silas had made something. It was enough. It was by any honest measure more than enough.